Kashi Prasad Ghosh was a Bengali poet and the editor of an English language journal that was published in Calcutta. He fell in love with English language during his years at Hindu College. He was enchanted with English poetry and offered literary criticism on various English texts. His writings were published in prestigious columns and soon attracted the likes of many scholars and leaders of Calcutta conservative Hindu society. His penchant for English language held a strong control over his medium of expressing his beliefs. Kashi Prasad wrote an essay on Mr. Mill's History of India, which received accolades from various quarters. Soon after, he published a volume of poems known as the Sher, which reached Lord William Bentinck, the Governor General of India. His poem, The Hindu Festival, primarily revolved around the myriad festivities of Bengal. Kashi Prasad Ghosh's books on Bengali poetry and on Bengali works and writers were an attempt to critique Bengali poetry and contemporary poets. The Memory of Indian Dynasties is another significant text in which unearthed the history of various Indian kings. To a Dead Crow by Kashi Prasad Ghosh is a poem written on the theme of love and death. The poem is elegiac as well as pathetic and at the same time meditative. Like other poems of the poet, this piece of poetry is also written in symbol diction. The poem consists of 4 stanzas, and each stanza bears independent thought and feeling pertaining to a dead crow. In the first stanza, the poet says about the crow when it was alive. The poet addresses the crow as the gay minstrel of the Indian clime, that means cheerful singing bird of India, and says that while it was living, it came out from its nest every morning and sang caw-caw in numbers, which vexed the mind of the poet and awoke him from sleep. The poet hated the sound of the crow, and to avoid the sound of the crow, he walked out in his garden, where there was a tank on a spacious piece of land. Besides the tank, there bloomed various kinds of flowers, such as lilies, jasmine, roses, etc. In the garden, there were many trees and thick foliage of trees. Amid the foliage of the trees, the crow built its nest. There the crow took a rest after daily labor. But suddenly, one day, the crow died. In the second stanza, the poet says about what the crow did during the days it was living. The poet, noticing the dead crow, goes back to his past. While it was living, it took the offals of the poet's meal. It took food from the rubbish, but now it is no more. It is still, and its eyes are shut forever. Its beak is not active to seek food from the carcasses, or it is no more to catch the mice from the poet's home. It is dead, and it will never come to stray and bask in the sunlight. The poet's thoughts and feelings surrounding the dead crow run on, and in the third stanza, he says, if death did not come to the crow, but death had taken the soul of the crow with its destructive sharpened dart. The death pierced his dart to the heart of the crow. Though life is no more in the crow, yet the poet feels that the crow is still warm. The eyes of the crow are so open that it seems to be alive. Now the crow is dead, and death no more can impair the quality, the form and features of the crow. Still, now its former ugliness is in it. In the fourth but the last stanza, the poet meditates and anticipates his own death. When death will come to the poet, his eyes must shut and his soul will be exempted from earthly bondage and would fly to heaven and meet eternity. And then the poet's body will remain to lie on the cold lap of the earth. Then the poet would not be able to compose a verse to please the public ears. Here the poet thinks that while the crow was living, the poet thought of its voice to be harsh and unlucky, so he hated the voice of the crow. But while the crow dies, the poet thinks that its voice had poured the voice of joy and delight. So would happen to the verses of the poet. At last, the poet thinks if he meets death at this moment, then it will be his last poem. In the poem To a Dead Crow by Kashi Prasad Ghosh, it can be seen as a nature poem with a note of mysticism. The poet's kind feeling for the dead crow, a wild bird, is really a silly matter, but poetically it is very significant as the poet succeeds to arouse his reader's sympathy towards the dead crow. The language used in the poem is simple. The second stanza is rich in visual imagery. The poet then gives a picture about the activities and life of a crow. Even though the poet is initially irritated and vexed about it, later the poet feels sympathetic and even feels sorry for Crow's sudden departure. The poet incorporates the story of Bavari Jataka and shows how a crow who was once famous lost its glory in the line the Indian crow hath known to fame. The poet uses a coupled rhyme pattern of AABBCC, thus making the poem more soothing to the ears. The poet uses simple diction and tone for his poem. The subtle theme and content makes the poem more indigenous and rustic in nature.